All right, folks, thanks for being here. My name is Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. Thrilled to have you all here today. I'm thrilled to have a great panel. We're pleased to convene today's discussion behind the strikes, technology targeting, and the Iran conflict. As many of you have seen in the recent reporting, Operation Epic Fury demonstrates the central role that advanced technologies are playing in modern warfare, from AI-enabled intelligence to targeting cyber operations, unmanned systems, and integrated multi-domain capabilities. We've even just seen the targeting of data centers in the region just in the last few days. We have an astounding panel with us this morning. I want to start by thanking General Karen Gibson, to my immediate right, who brings extraordinary experience for her time as Director of Intelligence at U.S. Central Command, in addition to her time as Sergeant Arms for the U.S. Senate, Deputy Commander of Army Cyber, and the like. She's also a member of NSI's Advisory Board, so thank you, General Gibson, for being here. Immediately to her right, Admiral Mark Montgomery serves as Senior Director for FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, is also a Distinguished Fellow with NSI's Cyber and Technology Center, and Admiral Montgomery obviously been in and around national security for many, many years. And last but certainly not least, Melissa Dalton. Ms. Dalton is the former Undersecretary of the Air Force, where she led strategy, capabilities, and technology integration across the Air and Space Forces. So a tremendous amount of experience on this panel to talk about the role of technology in the ongoing conflict. So what I'd like to do, though, is to sort of start with something of a sit-rep when it comes to what's going on right now in the conflict. We're on day 26, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. There are discussions about a 15-point peace plan, but I'm interested to know sort of where we are, and I think you're best to start, General Gibson, having been the Director of Intelligence at U.S. CENTCOM. Give us a sense of where things stand today in the conflict, where we are in the use of technology and operations. Then we'll talk to Admiral Montgomery and Ms. Dalton, give us some insights as well, and then we'll jump into the questions. And we will have time, by the way, during this conversation for questions from you all, so please have questions at the ready. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I think, having been very familiar with the Iranian op plan when I was at U.S. Central Command and being responsible for the Iranian target deck, development and maintenance of those targets, certainly we've had tremendous military success against the military objectives that we've been given. I can say from an Iranian perspective, nothing Iran has done has come as a surprise to me. I think it's largely what we predicted at U.S. Central Command.
Closing the Straits of Hormuz, no surprise?
Nothing they have done has come as a surprise. I think the only surprises have been the things that haven't happened, like cyber attacks against critical infrastructure.
Here in the U.S., you mean?
Yes, cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, sleeper agents conducting terror attacks, or the Houthis sitting it out over in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. That has probably been my biggest.
And why do you think that is? Why have we not seen, I think that a lot of people expected a cyber response. Why haven't we seen that against critical infrastructure here in the U.S.? We've seen limited cyber attacks by Iranian proxies. Why haven't we seen that?
So I think that, I don't mean that we overestimated them from a cyber perspective, but, and without straying into classified information, certainly much of what I ever saw regarding Iranian cyber activity was largely traditional computer network exploitation and intelligence collection, and I did not have access to see. Perhaps they didn't really have points of presence on our critical infrastructure and an ability to hold it at risk. And I would also say I don't know, that they haven't attempted attacks and been thwarted, or that we are more hardened than I realize. So that's a good thing. I would just briefly, because I know we have other folks who will share their perspectives on the war as well. Iran, I think their strategy at this point is to, A, stay alive, keep the regime alive, keep the straits in play. That is their greatest hand. That is their most significant leverage, and that is their ability to disrupt commerce and navigation, not just in the Straits of Hormuz, but the Gulf writ large, and in the Gulf nations on the other side, as we see those kinds of targets. And so I think their strategy, and we see the diminished number of missiles and drones that are crossing. And folks say, look how much success we've had. We have had tremendous success against integrating their missile and drone capability. But that's not to say that they aren't husbanding what they have left, stringing it out, because the longer they don't have to lose it all in an Armageddon-like barrage if they can continue to hold the straits at risk as long as possible to make this politically and economically infeasible for us to continue the war. And the last part I'd say on that is there is often a tendency to discount or forget about an ability to reconstitute, whether that's fighters or material. And so I think that's largely what Iran is up to.
Well, Admiral Montgomery, so General Gibson tells us that the key part of this operation, I think we were all seeing it now, is to hold the straits at risk. You've run FONOPs globally, freedom of navigation operations. You've escorted ships and been in this sort of process. Tell us how we should be thinking about what's happening in the Straits now. Tell us about how we should be thinking about the fact that this Marine Expeditionary Unit is about to arrive, the 82nd Airborne is about to show up. What is the purpose of those forces, and what in your mind, what's the plan?
So,
Such as there is one.
yeah. I just talk loud. So my take is that I agree with what General Gibson said. I think it's basically you have to continue the air campaign for the next few weeks, first of all. That's the ways and means of this event. And I think we've laid out the ways and means very well, the 5 or 6 lines of effort that we're pursuing in missiles, drones, naval capabilities, air suppression of enemy air defense, and attacking IRGC leadership, and the nuclear program. Those would be the 6. The risk we have is terminating those war aims early. It's the greatest risk we have, and terminating those war aims while Iran is still in charge of the Straits of Hormuz. Both of those would be unacceptable, and I think there's some likelihood that's going to happen with this president. You don't start a war unless you're willing to finish it, and I'm confident he was told from the beginning this was a 5 or 6 week air campaign. So you continue that, and you say, well, how do you open the Straits? So I mean, I've done Straits of Hormuz transits before with the angry Iran, and the way you've got to do it is you have to reduce their ability to impact you to an acceptable minimum military risk. And what that means is you have to get rid of enough drones, fast patrol craft, anti-ship cruise missiles, and mines so that you feel you can safely operate, with a package to bring it through the convoy. So to do that, that's what we're triding. And I agree. In general, I do think their missiles are gone. I think that we are triding their missiles down to 90+%, and we're destroying their future production.
The missiles themselves or the launch capabilities? I hear there's a debate about this, right?
Yeah.
I know that we've taken out, you think we've taken out enough of the missiles?
I think we've done a lot of, between us and the Israelis, we've done a lot of both. Now look, that doesn't mean zero.
Yeah.
But it means not the ability to launch an overwhelming attack. And on the anti-ship cruise missiles, I think it's both.
Yeah.
Now look, that doesn't mean they have zero, but you can't put like an anti-ship cruise missile, in the Jaffa garage, no matter how big it is.
I won't be so sure. I don't know.
With a missile tail, attached to a missile tail. On the other hand, with a friend, I've carried Shahed drones. They're not that big. They're not heavy, and I could put 10 or 12 in the Jaffa garage, right?
In Ukraine.
In Ukraine, yeah. That is generally the same. The drones and Shaheds. So, my take is that I'm a little more worried about them, but their ability to collect, so you take those down. All 4 of those kind of capabilities: mines, missiles, surface attack craft, and drones down to a minimum. And then you decide to do a convoy. To do a convoy, you set it up by having combat air patrol overhead, which is probably about 8 aircraft, 4x2. F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, all equipped with advanced precision kill weapon systems, which I've talked about a lot because we've seen them in Ukraine for the last year. And the U.S. Air Force has used them effectively to knock down attacks on Israel. But you need a lot of them up there because they're going to have to operate very quickly. And, it's still a system where you have to get in a launch position and launch the rocket. Then you have to have attack helicopters or A-10s to chew up the surface attack craft coming out. And then you have to have a very good precision.
What do you use, A-10s? I thought we stopped using A-10s. I thought Congress was
we've been
repeatedly...
We've been using A-10 as you may recall. The senator I worked for, Senator McCain, was an ardent defender of the A-10.
They're the best.
And for the exact reason we're talking about, which is that this is not an F-35 mission. Now, I will say, I'll be surprised if I see A-10s flying at night over water doing this mission. It's a close to the deck mission.
Sure.
And I think I'd use attack helicopters where both the Navy and Army pilots are a little bit more skilled in this, a little more proficient is what I'd say. And so, and then you need a persistent staring eye that's really focused on that area and not other parts of Iran. I mean, it can see other parts of Iran, but it needs to be focused there. Because if somebody pops up with something, one of those F-15s, F-16s, F-18s needs to put a weapon on it very quickly. And then finally, you need destroyers. You need destroyers to do the escorts. I recall doing 2 surface ships, like a frigate and a destroyer, escorting 3 to 4 tankers was what we generally did. That's about the number. We can get the spacing right for air defense. You could probably fit in a little bit extra with more capable DDGs, but I still would initially be very careful. But
That's a big package to take through a tight spot.
yeah,
in the
5
strait.
ships. Yeah, it's doable, but it's doable. And so my take on it is that, and if you took out 8, VLCCs, those are the very large container ships, a day, that's 16 million barrels of oil, which is nice. Now that doesn't solve your fertilizer and LNG problem initially, but I think we can get there. But the question is, Admiral Cooper has to say out loud, the military risk is low enough to do this. And one of the things I've noticed with senior military leaders is that when you're doing planning, a 90% solution sounds pretty good. When you're doing execution, they try to get 98, 99%, and that drives politicians crazy.
Could I add one thing briefly to that? So Admiral Montgomery has talked about lowering the military risk and making it acceptable. The decision to transit the straits, that will not be a military decision or a political decision, but a commercial business decision on the part of commercial entities and insurers who say the risk is low enough. And that's where I think a ceasefire or there's the need to demonstrate some level of diplomatic progress, which we're starting to see now, is critical. It's not just about the military escort.
Well, so this is an interesting question. I do want to get into this, but I do want to go to Ms. Dalton first, just on the situation. I think this question about the need for a peace process or ceasefire in place, I think is an interesting one. Ms. Dalton, I want to talk about the air campaign, because what we heard from General Gibson, and particularly from Admiral Montgomery, is that the air campaign's got to go on for at least a while longer, right? At least a few more weeks, to really be successful and really put the Iranians in a place where they're going to be forced to negotiate and come to a deal. Is that how you see it? You've been involved in the planning and strategy around these air campaigns and space and cyber operations for a while. Talk to us about how you see the current situation and the current dynamic.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to join this great panel, and just a few points to contribute to General Gibson and Admiral Montgomery's excellent laydown. One is certainly this plan has been examined, as General Gibson emphasized, for years, well understood, well thought out, and now well executed. And I think tremendous credit should be given to our military professionals in terms of the tactical and operational objectives that they've been able to achieve in short order. I would agree with General Gibson's analysis of what is interesting that hasn't happened. And I would add to that context the fact that the Israelis largely degraded the Iranian proxy network in the years prior to this operation. So the Iranians' ability to counteract in the region and against U.S. and allied and Israeli interest is significantly diminished. So that certainly changes the character of this campaign and the ability for the United States to press the campaign, not just in these first few weeks, but to contemplate how long they need to continue pressing to really accomplish those objectives vis-a-vis the ballistic missile infrastructure, production capability of the overall defense industrial base, and the remnants of the nuclear program. I think what lingers is certainly the strategic endgame for this campaign, and to the question of how long to continue pressing on the air campaign, that grows a bit more tenuous when you think about the global trade-offs that overall the U.S. military is having to make, and then specifically for our air and space and cyber forces. And I know we'll get into this a little bit later in the conversation in terms of the munitions picture in particular, and some of the cost imbalances that we're seeing. And then I think, over the longer term, having an assessment of how far back have the Iranian capabilities been pushed, how degraded are they actually, to General Gibson's point earlier, what is their ability to reconstitute? And it seems that regime change may not be on the table for the United States anymore. And so in a future scenario where you have an Iranian entrenched IRGC-backed regime that has now been embarrassed by the United States and Israel, you would think that the incentives and their will to really rebuild their capabilities is going to be on steroids. And then I think there's the other aspect of what we have seen from Iran over time in terms of their retaliation sometimes takes time to manifest, either because of what targets are available, but also because they like to execute their operations at the time and place of their choosing. So it may be a few years before we see the tail of this. I know Admiral Montgomery hit on some of the air aspects, but just in brief to fill in some of that picture beyond what he discussed in terms of the fighters and the close air support. Certainly we've also seen our bombers deployed, both B-1s and B-52s out of bases in Europe that have been involved in dropping some of the heavy munitions, and including the MOP on underground facilities. Also important to capture, and this links to how long these operations are going to go on, is that it does come with a cost to readiness for our military, but also in terms of human life. We did have the KC-135 go down in Iraq, lost 6 airmen. There was also the loss of the 3 F-15E Strike Eagles that are in relative short supply and readiness as well. Luckily, no human life lost there. That is a direct consequence of when we conduct these types of operations. And so the longer that this goes on, those risks certainly will hold. And then just briefly to hit on space, because we haven't really discussed that. Our Space Force and Space Command, other space elements, were very helpful in terms of the opening end of this operation to degrade Iranian IADs through various techniques that I won't get into here, but likely included forms of electronic warfare, cyber jamming and blinding to enable then our air power sorties to be quite effective. And then as the campaign has gone on, we've seen Space Force assets playing a critical role in terms of missile warning to protect U.S. forces in theater, as well as our allies and partners from Iranian ballistic missile retaliations. And then the whole enterprise of this operation is certainly enabled by space capabilities for Operation Epic Fury, from satellite communications to position navigation and timing that are essential for the precision of the operations and ensuring we're hitting the right targets.
So thanks, that's really helpful. I do want to hit on one point, and I know we're here to talk about technology, but I can't resist hitting on one point that you raised in this conversation, which is if in fact, I mean, the president began this conflict with a Truth Social post where he talked about the importance of the Iranian people rising up in the aftermath of our bombing campaign to really replace their government, referring to it as a generational opportunity and the like. And it does appear that at least in these negotiations, this 15-point plan and the like, that assuming that the Iranian regime were to agree to these 15 points, which they never will, but if they were going to agree to it, that the regime would essentially stay in place. In that scenario, isn't, General Gibson, I mentioned your and Admiral Montgomery's thoughts, isn't the takeaway from that the regime that remains in place has no option but to get a nuclear weapon? Because to avoid another conflict like this, another embarrassment that they experience, they've got to be asking themselves, why isn't North Korea seeing an operation like this? And the answer is, probably North Korea has a nuclear weapon. Doesn't this just simply cement their desire to get a nuclear capability? And if so, does that suggest that we should pursue regime change? Or does that suggest that we should somehow actually take nuclear capabilities off the table? And if so, how do we do that, given that we've dropped the MOP, it did what it did, the program is still there, they still have 440 kilograms of 60% HEU, another 200 kilograms of 20+%. What are we doing here?
Okay, so I have a couple thoughts on this. First, regarding regime change. If 95% of the Iranian people are opposed to the Islamic Republic and they want to live under a different system of government, yes,
by and large.
I would submit you cannot remove men with guns who are in charge. You can't remove them without more people with guns.
On the ground, you mean?
Yes. And, whether those are, and we've done that in the past with proxy forces, the Iraqi army against ISIS, Syrian Kurds against ISIS.
We'd be pouring weapons into this fight, right, covertly if we wanted to, but we're not, as far as we can tell.
But also, I think when you consider the size and the commitment of the IRGC, which I think is the strategic center of gravity, and anyone who doubts their commitment to sustaining the Islamic Republic need only look back at December, their willingness to openly gun down tens of thousands of their own civilians. That's how committed they are.
I mean, 300,000 RGC, 190,000 regular army, and then 600,000 Basij, right? That's the real, I mean, 1 million men and women under arms, that's a problem.
Yeah,
Men,
I think it was less than 1,000 ISIS who held the city of Mosul for how long, that was millions of people. So it takes men on the ground with guns. Not American boots on the ground per se, but it will take a force on the ground.
Which does appear we're putting in.
Right, so then if we assume that the Islamic Republic in some form, perhaps as a rump state, will continue, it would be critical then, I think, in that negotiation that there be very strict controls, and because I agree with you, they'll be totally incentivized to get a nuclear weapon. Very strict controls, a considerable inspection, criteria and framework that is in place to ensure that it doesn't happen. And I've always said that as soon as the Israelis get a whiff of Iran striving for a nuclear weapon, expect strikes at any time, the mowing the grass, so to speak.
Yeah. Admiral?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not sure what the president's initial strategic end state was, since he's changed it 3 or 4 times in the first couple days, and in some speeches he changes it 3 or 4 times in a campaign.
In a single speech.
Yeah, so that's hard. I will tell you that we have done air power driven regime changes, but both times there were armed insurrectionists on the ground, the KLA in 1999 and 2011 in Libya. In both cases, more than 50,000 armed insurgents on the ground.
Libya didn't quite work out for us.
No, it did for overthrowing the regime.
Right.
Now we have 2 states.
Muammar Gaddafi would have.
Yeah, Muammar's not around.
If you're asking me, democracy initiatives work, I would say nowhere. I mean, maybe Kosovo, but even that's tough. I would say that to do this, you needed to have that. I was a little surprised when it kicked off, and there was clearly there had been no effort to do that.
Yeah.
And so I think we're in trouble now. And I'll say this about the president: judging by Venezuela, he is, promoting democracy is not high on his list.
Yeah.
It's somewhere below extracting oil on the national security interest. And he's the president; that's his choice. So if I were an Iranian activist, I'd probably lay low, for reasonably speaking. Now I will say, all those different armed groups aren't the same. My take on the Artesh, the Iranian, traditional Army, Navy, or Navy, Army, Air Force in this case, are that they are different than the IRGC. They're not near as
committed,
as ideological, committed. So there's some opportunity there, but so far we have not been able to exploit that.
Yeah. Ms. Dalton, any thoughts on this sort of question about regime change versus, since you raised it, versus sort of the nuclear capability?
I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
So I do, the purpose of this was to talk more about tech, and I've allowed myself to lure it into the larger Iran conflict debate. But General Gibson, talk to us about the use of AI in this campaign. I mean, AI is the hot buzzword of our year, if not of the last 3 years, and it's been hot in the news when it comes to DOW and Anthropic, and we know about Maven Smart System and its capabilities that have been deployed now for years, and really being used in the field now. We've talked about Palantir and the like. Talk to us about what's going on with the use of AI in this conflict, maybe in Venezuela, how we see it, and what relevance, if any, this sort of fight between the Department of War on one side and Anthropic on the other might have to conflicts like this going forward.
Okay, gosh, it's like
not a big question.
Yeah, no. At risk of turning this into a targeting primer, I do think it's important to just kind of lay some foundational terminology. I get a little frustrated in the media when we talk about number of targets or number of bombs because the true unit of measure hasn't been applied to those. So like if you blow up a building but you use 20 munitions, does that count as 20 or 1? So there's just a lot of vagueness in some of that discussion. I would differentiate between deliberate targets, which are pre-planned, built into the air tasking order, typically added 24 to 96 hours out, and dynamic targets, which are a lot of when an F-35 sensor-to-shooter kind of target of opportunity that the sensors pick up, and that is probably a lot closer to artificial intelligence, certainly that automated linkage of various signatures and then a decision.
Radar paints you got to move.
Yeah, that's probably much closer than what is happening or what happens with deliberate targets. In any campaign, particularly this kind, we had, as I mentioned, at U.S. Central Command, hundreds, thousands of pre-planned targets or targets in a library that could be selected from. Those are deliberate targets. And when you start a campaign, it's pre-planned the first couple of days. We're going to take out integrated air defense. We're going to take out command and control. What are the things we need to remove so that we can operate freely and then go after other more strategic targets? That's planned. And in a campaign, it starts out 100% deliberate, and then that's going to go down, although you're going to fight and use intel.
Because you're eliminating them.
Right, because you're eliminating, but now, you're discovering new targets, that'll go up, and the dynamic targeting starts to go up. I would say in this campaign, in any campaign, one of the chief sources of dynamic targets is supporting troops in contact, close air support, support on the battlefield. Because we don't have boots on the ground, there's probably a lot less of that dynamic targeting, and it's still predominantly deliberate targeting. The intel team is putting together a picture of identifying targets that could be struck deliberately based on various signatures. There's a lot of room for artificial intelligence to assist you with that.
And by signatures, you mean radar signatures?
It could be imagery, it could be handsets, it could be communications.
Devices you're picking up.
Imagery, signals intelligence, human intelligence, open source intelligence. And you put that together. When I approved or vetted targets, we always had it had to come from multiple sources, and you'll also be wanting to look at the timeliness of the information that goes into it. Is that still a naval base or is potentially a school? But, you have to look at the timeliness, and then a lot of people just think that that's targeting. But that's actually basic target development. Then it goes to the opside, advanced target development, which is deciding if I want to take out the Longworth office building, where do I need to drop rounds, what kind of munitions am I going to have, am I going to use, what will the blast radius be, how much damage will be. That takes like 24 to 48 hours, sometimes longer, depending on the complexity of the target. That's a huge area where potentially artificial intelligence could be used. And then the third part, which I would have loved to have AI for, is collateral damage estimates. And collateral damage is how many innocent lives may be lost when we strike this target. In Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, it's a lot of establishing pattern of life around a building, and depending on what kind of munition I'm going to use and how big is the blast radius, you may select a time of day or a day of the week to strike it when, maybe I'm going to strike it on a Sunday morning. It's next to a school and there's no school on Sundays and I don't want to strike it during the week. That's really labor intensive and it requires a lot of intelligence. If I had ubiquitous surveillance, like, an unseeing eye, man, I could turn that on a dime and it's very time consuming. So to your point about humans in the loop, I think any time we are making a decision that could result in the loss of life, there needs to be a person in the loop. I could dramatically accelerate all three of those steps, identifying what I want to strike, how am I going to strike it, doing a collateral damage estimate, but at the end of the day, the American way of war, where we are committed to living within the law of armed conflict, we need a human being who makes that decision.
And so, Admiral Montgomery, this is current DoD policy, right? Human in the loop, human on the loop for any operation involving lethal force. That being said, at some point, whether it's this conflict or a future Taiwan conflict with China or the like, at some point our adversary may make the unilateral decision to operate autonomously without a human in the loop on their side. What does that do for the U.S. ability to respond in time if we require by policy or by statute if Congress decides to pass a law, or by company fiat if a company gets to decide what capabilities it provides the government or not? What happens when the adversary decides to go autonomous and without a human in the loop, and we don't? Does that make it impossible for us to compete, or do we have to go down that road? And if we do, how do we sort of deal with the sort of ethical policy challenges that raises?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Like, first, I do want to acknowledge that Anthropic has done very well in combat over the last 5 weeks.
Even though we kicked them out, and we're not going to use them going
Well,
forward.
we kicked them out 180 days.
Right.
And now
It's good
130
timing, right? Works out pretty well.
But
It's a supply chain risk, but it can stay in the supply chain for at least 180 days.
yeah, and I think that's altering itself too. I mean, that's one of those things where you like, if you guys remember the movie like Anchorman, and Will Ferrell goes, "Hey, that got out of control fast." That argument got out of control way too fast. That was
It was
unprofessional.
egos.
Yeah, and the Secretary of Defense is, too involved in things that are below his pay grade.
I mean, look, this was a great story. We got a CEO of a company and the Secretary of Defense sort of, putting their egos in the middle of this whole thing.
I agree. Now, I will say, on the issue of will we eventually have man on the loop and then out of the loop, yes. There's no way you're going to be able to warfight in the future with one side having an OODA loop that is microseconds and the other side having an OODA loop that has a human thinking in it. Those two things don't coexist. We knew this. There's a system called, there's an Aegis weapon system. It's on our Arleigh destroyer.
For decades.
We've had it on there for 45 years. We've had a system, actually about 45 years, we've had a system called Aegis Auto. It's a selection you can have. I think for the first 20...
Just to be clear, so you turn it on, and it looks for inbound missiles.
Once the captain turns what's called the fizz, you don't need to go to the firing integrity switch green, which means you can fire. The system works in auto.
It goes, and it looks for targets and shoots them down.
I think for the first 25 years, that was machine learning. It was like we gave it doctrine statements. But after a while, the software evolved to a point where we're giving it doctrine statements and it's thinking about how to employ them. I think at that point, when people say we've had AI in weapon systems and in computer systems for years, this is one of those places. Now, I will say, to my knowledge, and my knowledge is pretty accurate on this, I think, we've never used Aegis Auto in real world, right? We've used it in some training and exercises. You do put the switch over to make sure it still makes contacts, but we've never had to. But we also haven't faced an enemy with an overwhelming ability to overwhelm your air defense systems when a human's on it. But I watch humans on the loop and humans in the loop in air combat environment, and they do slow the system down with good reason, right? To have a reasoned decision: do I fire or not fire? Now, we fired on the wrong thing with humans in the loop, and I'm confident we fire on the right thing with humans in the loop.
Vincennes sort of
the Vincennes is an example of that.
In the region.
And so I think we will reach a point in the not too distant future where we'll have to have automated systems with the man out of the loop. And whether they're running on machine learning or AI will depend on the exact system and how recent, as you may know, many of the weapon systems we developed in the Navy or in the Air Force, even though they look modern, are in fact based on 10 and 20-year-old hardware. But the software is fairly modernized, so I think we're close, a lot closer than people think. So it was probably correct for Dario to start complaining, because we're not near as far away as most of us think, from being in that position. Now, it is incorrect for him to want to be part of the department. What did he think, that the Department of Defense was going to use his weapon to, build a library? We were going to build his weapon to kill things. That's inherently, if you look at the mission of the Department of Defense, it is not to, build libraries and do humanitarian rescues.
Some people think it might be.
I think almost everyone who's ever been assigned to the Department of Defense recognizes that their primary job is to, be ready to conduct cost imposition on behalf of U.S. national security interests. And that means your system is going to be used for that. And for him to think otherwise, and he didn't think otherwise, he started to get a little bit of a staff revolt, and that's why this happened. We understand exactly what's going on here, which is the challenge of Silicon Valley companies wanting to make a lot of money off of the Department of Defense, but not really being that committed to the mission of the Department of Defense.
Well, so what about that, Ms. Dalton? I mean, we saw this happen back in 2018 with Google and Maven, and they had a staff revolt along the lines that Admiral Montgomery describes, and they sort of hopped out of the program. They're back in a big way. Google's sort of changed their mind on it. AWS, sort of saw the market opportunity and jumped on it faster than they did. But both Google and Microsoft and AWS are in. You've got the rise of Palantir and its sort of willingness to fight on behalf of the government, and Alice Karp's willingness to go fight in public with audiences about whether that's the right thing to do or not. But now you see Anthropic sort of going the other direction in a big way, and now in the middle of litigation, which they're likely to win on the supply chain risk issue, I think. But maybe a longer fight that they might not win. How should we be thinking about technology companies and the importance of the role they play in military operations, and how the government industry can figure this out going forward if this is going to keep happening?
Absolutely. It's critical that we get this right because the capability and capacity that the commercial sector can bring to bear to augment and partner with the U.S. military in the complex and contested operations that we see playing out and are plausible for the future, particularly when you're thinking about China. It's absolutely necessary that we have strong relationships with these key stakeholders. I think having some diversity of thought in terms of the best way to go about it is a good and healthy thing in terms of the competition of ideas for the technologies, but also the processes and the governance that should surround it. Not one person or one organization is going to have all the right answers in any situation, and so having some of that tension and diversity of thought, I think, is actually a good thing. Because the consequences are significant. We're talking about the prosecution of war and the loss of human life. We should make sure that we've got the best ideas sifted through. So, I would just add to the great thoughts from my co-panelists a couple of things. I agree that the trend lines are such that we will be employing the automation and up to the AI, perhaps generative AI level in terms of the ability to move as quickly as we would need to, particularly when you're looking at a China war fight. Just the number of targets and how interconnected they are and the speed of operations will necessitate it. But before we get there, let's take the time to incorporate this into our exercises in terms of learning what we are from how it's being employed right now in the Iran operation, and getting those sets and reps in to get the comfort level up in terms of anybody at any echelon knowing what are the right questions to ask, using your critical thinking skills. Does this actually make sense in the context that I understand and within the decision-making power that I have at whatever echelon that is? And then I also think it's not a blanket answer in terms of how reliant upon AI tools do we become. I think there are probably certain categories, such as our nuclear command and control, that we will always want to have a human making those decisions, and for any of our other strategic forces, given the consequences of that level of cost imposition. But at the more tactical level, maybe up through the operational level, it's going to be a necessary feature of prosecuting the types of war that we see on our horizon.
So this is
Let me ask.
Yeah, please.
We do have to also, first of all, I love that reference. That's for those of us of General Gibson's and my generation, that was the movie War Games. And
My generation too.
And the terminating of the art cybersecurity, turning the war. But what I wanted to comment on was the thing that was most galling about that was the penalty, and of you're a threat to the supply chain, because that minimizes the actual threat to the supply chain, which are the Chinese companies.
Huawei, ZTE.
Well, and this is the same moment that apparently the Department of Defense is looking to remove from the 1260H list, YMTC, SMIC, and CTMX,
Crazy.
actual Chinese companies. So it's nonsensical that we would add an American company whose flaw is they don't want to work with us, and we're fine, don't work with them. And treat them back that way, that's fine. And remove them from all the rest of the government if you think that's what you want to do. But don't label them a Chinese threat, because what that does is, the next time you'll see that information is in a court case by a Chinese company going, you can clearly see this is just a political tool, a weapon being poorly used by the president. And the president's being very let down by his Department of Defense, Department of Justice, when they go down these paths like this. There is an actual threat out there. We need to handle it like mature adults. And that is not what, throughout this whole sordid, 5 weeks, this has not been I would not call this a mature adult behavior.
I mean, look, the challenge is when you're making policy by Truth Social posts, right, or Twitter posts, right? I mean, that does make it hard for once the president or the Secretary of Defense has made a call about what's happening here, it's hard for the Department of Justice or the Department of War at that point to unwind that call.
I do think this is actually the Department of Defense. In fairness to Trump,
Yeah.
I think this is Hegseth, and
Yeah.
I think the Department of Justice was trying to detach itself from his tweets.
Well, so I think the interesting question that Ms. Dalton raises is this question about sort of being prepared for the day that you need more autonomous systems, more sort of artificial intelligence operating systems, even if you are limiting sort of key strategic calls to humans in the loop. You gotta train and prepare, and if that's the case, how do you do that in the context where there are certain players who it might be in the industry who say, well, I don't even want my capabilities to be used to train at this point, right? Because the Anthropic position was not, look, don't use it in a wartime context where people actually lose their lives. The point was, we don't want it used even in the training scenarios. And so how does that work, right? Is that, I mean, it's true that maybe they should use supply chain risk, but could the department have demanded under the Defense Production Act that Anthropic provide the capabilities? And could they have demanded they provide it sort of untethered from their restrictions?
I think if we were facing an existential threat in the way that the Islamic Republic is, then perhaps yes. But we are not facing an existential threat.
I mean, we're in a war, maybe of our choosing.
Sure, but there are wars and there are wars. I mean, this is, again, not the United States is not actually an attack, right? I mean, I think, there's a huge spectrum of risk to the United States and let's not go down that road. But I think, Mark brought up the point, this has happened before with firms, right? And I think in this hot AI environment, very competitive right now, that if the government said, I want nothing to do ever again with Anthropic, I do believe there are other firms that will race to that opportunity.
And we saw that, but I jumped in the next day.
Right,
and,
so I think it would be different if Anthropic were the only company in the world that could provide this
Yeah.
capability and the U.S. were under an existential threat, which it is not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Admiral or Ms. Dalton, thoughts on that?
I do. I still think we should have been able to come to some kind of agreement with them. It just disappoints me. It shows a lag. It doesn't bode well for the next 3 years of working with the defense industrial base if the immediate, the reflexive response by the department is to go to the max, and this is going to the max.
I mean, but to be fair, the company took a very maximalist position as well. I mean, it wasn't just Secretary Hegseth and Emma Michael being like, look, we're out. I mean, the company was taking a position they were making claims about the administration, about the government using engaging in mass surveillance of Americans, right? I mean, the claims about mass surveillance were about acquiring commercially available data, something that, yes, members of Congress, Senator Wyden has legislation on it, hasn't passed the Senate, hasn't passed the House, isn't American law, and yet that's the claim being made by a company to prevent the department from using its capability. I mean, both sides were playing maximalist.
I would say you go review appeals of decisions in procurement for the last, say, 50 years, and you'll see the same sort of maximist, right? Lawyers are paid a lot of money, lawyers like you are paid
Recovering.
are paid a lot of money to stake out the most extensive position to then negotiate back to the consensual middle.
Yeah.
And I think what happened was, as I said, this got it really got big fast, right? It got out of control fast. A normal discussion that should have been had by lawyers and GCs immediately became fodder for Politico and Axios way too quick.
Yeah.
And part of it's also, I think, the lack of trust and the lack of reliance on GCs by the secretary himself.
Yeah.
I mean, that contributes. We're going to see this again and again and again on issues where we have to walk back what he says when put in the light of a judicial review.
Yeah. So, Ms. Dalton, just you feel free to weigh in on this question. I probably maybe not, but one thing we talked about early on. And I do want to go to audience questions here in the last 10 minutes we've got, but you talked a little about cyber and space capabilities and the role they played in this domain. Do we see that role continue to grow as AI plays a bigger role? That sort of tipping and queuing between space assets, on the ground assets, intelligence collection from signals intelligence, like we heard General Gibson talk about, human intelligence. Do we see all of that playing a bigger role? And if so, how should we think about our vulnerabilities in the cyber and space domain?
That's a great question, and I'm sure Karen in particular and Mark will have thoughts on that too. I think this is actually a really ripe area and set of domains for the application of increased automation, machine learning, and then over time the integration of AI tools as well. Right now we have the privilege of just being awash in so much data. And as we add those layers of space and cyber at greater levels of sophistication and collection, it's going to exponentially increase the amount of data available. And so just the processing and integration of the data alone in order to be able to then operate with speed and agility and close those kill chains, particularly in a China, Taiwan type context, means that it's incumbent upon us to really be leveraging these types of tools to be able to better synthesize and understand the context and give that information to those that are actually going to be doing the targeting. And then as we discussed, over time you build the governance and the trust and the sets and reps in to be able to add that to closing the kill chains with kinetic effect. And pulling that along the process to the actual effectors. So I would heartily agree that we should keep the aperture wide open for that application, and I do believe the enterprise is very much leaning into that. I'll highlight particularly perhaps somewhat parochially from my prior job the great work the Air Force has been doing on C3PM, excuse me, under General Luke Cropsey. He's now moved into the full acquisition role, but enabling the Department of the Air Force Battle Network, which underlies CJADC2 for the department, really gets to the heart of what you're describing.
Real quick, first of all, I agree with all of that. Was right. I'm glad you said CJADC2. Every general officer that just says JADC2 should be tasered, because if you don't build the coalition in from the beginning, they can't afford to stay. But I want to talk a little about cyber, only because, like General Kane, I want to congratulate him. He's really tried to bring cyber into both the Venezuela and Iran. I worry when you have to set up a separate cell to do it. Generally speaking, when you set up a separate cell, it's kind of acknowledgement that the normal cell is not processing your things. And I do still think that we're not at the point. Cyber is now integrated into war plans. It's integrated into air plans, into tactical, into targeting. What I don't think is when you have a kinetic event going on nearby or the movement of forces nearby, I still don't think we rely solely on cyber to remove a threat.
No.
In other words, when you look at some of the Venezuela areas where they said, well, we took power down here, when you look at the transformer, there appears to be a lot of holes in it. So we may have used cyber, and then I think a kinetic weapon hit it. And so I think we're doing double taps on things with cyber and non-cyber. It'll be an interesting point when a commander is so trustworthy, trusting a cyber, that she or he allows a cyber-only effect to be applied, and then flies, in some air defense system, and then flies
Puts humans at risk.
the inbound strike over it and assumes the risk. And I'll say this, I also see this in directed energy, like everyone tells me, Iron Beam's doing great. I'm just like, hey, let's talk to that Israeli ground commander and tell me which Iron Dome, which places did he put Iron Beam and remove Iron Dome? And the answer is nowhere. Just like when I talk to the ship captains who have our phased array, our directed energy systems, it's still just another last-ditch weapon. So we have to. This stuff's coming along in both cyber, directed energy, other areas, but it's still enforcing or amplifying, not replacing the kinetic tools that we hope it's someday for them to replace.
But that's always how it's been, right? You've always played that game with new advanced
Cyber's been a long dance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we thought about using cyber tools in Kosovo in 1999,
Fair.
and that's 27 years ago, and we're using them now. That's the good news. We've shortened the timeline to get cyber in there. We're not displacing kinetic effects yet.
Yeah. Keith Alexander used to argue that we would, and I think that I agree with you, that's false. And I agree with both Mark and Melissa on all the great comments they've just made in this regard. I would point out, this integration across all the domains and using artificial intelligence is, for me, as a ground pounder, a natural evolution, less than revolution, of combined arms warfare, which was tactical integration of fires and maneuver, to joint warfare, which is bringing together the power of all of our military arms, to now bringing together synchronous, simultaneous operations in every operating domain.
Yeah.
It's an evolution. But with each new capability, you also introduce some vulnerabilities that you can't forget about. And so as we increasingly use artificial intelligence and this kind of networked effects, can't forget about the criticality of actual communication network resilience, of protecting data centers, of our vulnerability, in a sense, to our reliance on space.
Yeah.
Right? And so, in the event that you ever lose your calculator, I hope you still remember how to do long division with a pencil and a piece of paper. And so I hope
I don't know about that.
And so I hope that we do not forget how to do the equivalent of long division, should we be up against a real peer adversary, unlike Iran, who is able to take from us, potentially, some of these capabilities that we're so reliant on.
Yeah, it's a great point. All right, so folks, we have about 5-6 minutes. Questions for the audience?
Scrutiny poor model.
Yeah, sir.
So you mentioned data centers. I think so I work for SAP, there are data centers in the Middle East that were impacted by this conflict. And I think there's a real fragility of data centers that people don't think, especially with the amount of data and AI. So one, and two, the supply chain of AI. So there's the immediate consumer Department of War doing their use cases. But in the software supply chain, there's use of AI farther back to the left that can be impacted by these decisions of cutting off a property. So if you could comment on those things.
So let me just repeat the question. So one, the impact on data centers in the Middle East in this conflict and the vulnerability that might present. And then second, the question about the cutting off of these capabilities and what that might implicate for our use in the future as well. So
I would just say on the data center piece, I think you've given a great example that specifies what I was just talking about in terms of new capabilities also tend to introduce new vulnerabilities. And data centers are kind of obvious, but even, as you say, going back further into supply chain, et cetera, to look at those. Yesterday I was at an event where someone said, do we need to put Iron Dome over Loudoun County? Because of all the data, they were saying it flippantly, but it is again, these new capabilities introduce new vulnerabilities.
But this is exactly the question.
If Maryland was attacking Virginia, then you would. And so, look, it's critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it shows the water, the desalinization plants, which both the data centers and humans need, the power system, which was the data center humans need. Those things need to be protected. There was a flaw in the mostly the Army, but all the joint forces development of counter-UAS. You could see this for 3 years. There's no excuse for...
Well, it's still there today.
There's you knock down drones with a two-layered system. One is an airborne system that does wide area, F-16s in Ukraine, but F-15s, F-16s, F-18s in America, and that thins the herd. But in the end, you need point defense for military critical infrastructure like air bases, radar systems, and national critical infrastructure, data centers, water, energy. We are missing that, and when the U.S. is missing something, its allies are usually missing it as well. Our Arab partners are missing it, and we just don't have that. And we're getting it from Ukraine in a limited capacity, very late. The Ukrainians offered it to us 2 years ago. They offered it to us 8 months ago, and we were too smart and knew better. And as a result, we don't have these systems. These were very exportable systems. Now they're harder to use because we don't like to fire weapons around that are not in a link around where our air defense assets are. But our choice, it's become pretty bare bones. Get hit or buy a counter-UAS system. And so I think we're going to buy the counter-UAS systems now and then figure out how to link them in.
Well, Ms. Alton, what about that question on counter-UAS, but also expand it on the cyber domain, right? Because we know that our adversaries are coming after U.S. critical infrastructure and allied critical infrastructure. Secretary Panetta said, well over a decade ago now, that it was the domain of the Department of Defense to defend the nations in the cyber domain. It's the role of the Department of Defense to defend the nation's cyber domain. And yet we don't really do that. And our critical infrastructure is vulnerable to cyber attacks and the like, and the UAS. We're not doing that today on UAS. We're not doing that cyber domain. Do we have to wait for the day when our critical infrastructure goes down and we're unable to use it to really realize that that's what it's going to take? Or is there some public-private partnership? We always talk about that can solve this problem.
Yeah, I think it's an increasing area of concern, and we actually have been under attack in the United States. When you look at U.S. air bases and space bases and counter-UAS overflight and penetration of them over the last several years, I'll give credit to the department that they have set up a counter-UAS task force that knits together some of the disparate nodes that have been approaching this. And I'm hopeful that good work will come from that, but still far more to be done, and look no further than Ukraine, and the attack that they were able to conduct in Russia, and then more broadly what we're learning from the Iran conflict in terms of the United States and Israel going after the Iranian defense industrial base and supporting critical infrastructure, and then Iran doing that in return, all means that in a conflict, the U.S. homeland would be quite vulnerable. And we know from the Chinese theory of victory that they would seek to subvert force flow mobilization from the United States, going after our critical infrastructure on the civilian side that enables all of our force to project power into the Indo-Pacific. I am very concerned about some of the choices that have been made in the last year to degrade the capabilities of CISA. And not take our cyber security as seriously as we should.
And not to mention the thousands of containers coming up, tens of thousands of containers coming over from China every year that could have an operation like the Ukraine's conducted in Russia. All right, well, folks, we're at time. Thank you for being here. I want to mention, thank you to our panelists, Ms. Dalton, General Gibson, everyone Montgomery, for a great discussion. Before we wrap, I do want to flag an upcoming NSI event on April 14th. Called AI on the Battlefield. We'll actually be talking about this exact issue, Anthropic, the Department of War, the use of AI. We'll be joined by Katrina Mulligan from OpenAI, Nathan Lemur from Fiskier Strategies, and Sam Hammond from FAI, so we'll hope you join us for that. Feel free to flag down an NSI staffer, pass on a business card if you're interested. They can help you get registered, and thanks again for being here. Thanks, everybody.